Hey class, how's it going? So for today's lecture, gonna kind of do a little bit of a reset here, and actually let me get rid of this thing. Um, and thus far as you've probably noticed, everything we've talked about, this sort of story leading up to more and more closer to the present, has been a little bit sort of Eurocentric. I mean, a lot of it, what we've talked about, is taking place in what is today the Middle East. But still, those civilizations from Mesopotamia, sort of modern day Iraq, are, usually viewed as the forerunners, the predecessors of, as we kind of talked about, like Greek, Roman society that eventually sort of, um, you know, it evolves into what we call Europe. Um, so that's kind of unfortunate that their focus has been so narrow on that sort of archaeological record so far. It's problematic for a lot of reasons. We will, in the next couple classes, talk about the Americas. We'll talk about some archaeology today in China, India, Japan. Um, and maybe next lecture we'll talk about Africa to some extent. But if you were to accuse the class of being a little sort of Western centric or Western focused, you would not be wrong. Um, I apologize for that. It is a little bit a product of how I was taught archaeology. Um, and it's a little bit of a product of how archaeology has been conducted the past 100 years. Um, there is extensive archaeology that's going on today in China, Japan, India, but less than you would like to see in Africa still. Um, Certainly, if you go back 100 years and look at archaeology's past, like the origins of the discipline archaeology, you did have the unfortunate circumstance, which I'm sure comes as no surprise, where you did have, white European guys hopping down into India and excavating their artifacts, and often cases bringing them back to Britain. Certainly, that's the case with much African archaeology. Um, and I hope that most people sort of see the problems with that, sort of claiming and stealing that cultural heritage and taking it back to Europe as part of the colonizing process that Europe embarked on these past 500 years or so. So that's a little bit why in some like Western introduction to archaeology textbooks or classes, um, you do maybe get less material on, the archaeology of China, even though obviously there's been humans in China just as long as there has been in Europe. Um, there's been, social and civilizational upheavals and changes in culture and technology in China that rival obviously all of those in Europe. But I actually am a little bit more ignorant of uh, that archaeological record. Um, so I know some of the hits. Obviously, I highly encourage anyone that does have a fascination in this region to do further digging. I'll try to like talk about some of these cases as best I can and try to get you excited about them so that you can sort of dig deeper on these questions and issues. So let's get into it. Um, okay, so let's start off in Japan here. There is this period, this called the Jomon period, which extends very, very long in time. Sometimes there's a loose equivalent made between what we've talked about as the Neolithic period and this Jomon period. Some people might say the Jomon is like the Japanese version of the Neolithic. It's a little oversimplifying. As we'll talk about, it's not quite, doesn't match up quite one to one with what we often refer to as uh, Neolithic lifestyles. But first off, let's just like take a second to think about how long archaeologists sort of demarcate this period. This is 13,000 BC to 400 BC. That's not there's not a wrong zero there. It's not 1,300 BC. So this is about 10,000 years, which is very long. If you kind of remember, this is like when we talk about the earliest um, agriculture, farming, Neolithic lifestyles in the Middle East. That's usually, kicking off around 10,000, maybe 11,000 BC. So this is just, it's close to that, but a little bit earlier. This is would have been right as, or a little bit before even the end of the Ice Age, really. I mean, the Ice Age is ending probably around here, but it's about 11,000 years ago that we usually say the Ice Age is officially over. Um, so uh, right. Very long, sustained period. Um, a lot can change in 10,000 years. And some people might argue that it's difficult to claim one sort of cultural continuity for 10,000 years. And certainly it seems like that would be very difficult in today's world. In 10,000 years, it'll be what? Today's 2024. Can you imagine in the year 12,000 AD, 10,000 years in the future? Um, it'll be very interesting. I would doubt there won't be, we won't be speaking the same language. I guarantee you that. English will not be around in 10,000 years. That's just, that's just the natural course of language evolution. I mean, even like you probably can't understand someone speaking English from 1,000 years ago, let alone 10,000 years in the future. Um, So it's difficult to, so I would also strongly almost like guarantee you that the Jomon language or languages did evolve, did change, and there's probably multiple of them. So some people have kind of argued that labeling this 10,000 year period in Japan as one sort of continuous culture is a little bit oversimplifying, and that there's actually, you know, probably a greater deal of cultural diversity than one name tends to reflect. This is a sample of the sort of Jomon pottery. Right, some people have, sort of suggested it's the Neolithic. Um, there is farming going on by the Japanese people in this Jomon period. So that's kind of one of the things that maybe makes it seem like it's the Neolithic. There is also some large scale settlements. Um, so those are, some of the prerequisites for a Neolithic period, right? Like farming um, and large habitat, like large settlements. Um, but uh, there is cultivation, there is some farming, but it does seem as though these are more often classified as this phrase that I don't love, complex hunter-gatherers. I would suggest that, all hunter-gatherers can be complex. But yeah, they are like planting some crops. Um, they, oftentimes hunter-gatherers are thought of as egalitarian, more, at least more so than sort of farming villages. But um, Uh, the suggestion about Jamon's sort of civilization or society is that it's like it can be like temporarily egalitarian. We've talked about this a little bit before, but like um uh it might be egalitarian during the summer and then hierarchical during the winter or something like that. That's something that's not uncommon to some hunter-gatherer populations. This word arboriculture there just means sort of maintenance of trees. When you're thinking of the first farmers, we should be thinking of like wheat and grasses and barley and rye and oats and things like that. You don't often think of, you know, managing tree populations, but obviously, um, we can get a lot of good food from trees, like, apples and stuff like that. Um, so it just seemed like there's some cultivation of trees. Arbor just means tree. So some of the sort of highlights or sort of aspects of society here among the Jamon people. There is, again, sometimes not nomadic. It seems like the majority of the calories are coming from hunting and gathering. Um, but it's kind of like sedentary living hunter-gatherers, if that, whereas like a proper Neolithic, you're getting most of your calories from uh farming. This is kind of weirdly seems like the inverse of what we'll talk about in the Americas a little bit later. Um, when agriculture starts in the Americas, agriculture sort of precedes sedentary living in a way that sort of seems the opposite here. Like here, people are like living in one place and hunting and gathering. In the Americas, the sort of trajectory in some cases is farming while still being nomadic, interestingly. Okay, yeah, so yeah, dense living, and you do see a lot of this sort of same like, big stone architecture like you see with the European Neolithic, like the Stonehenge sort of architecture. Maybe some timekeeping, maybe some calendars, certainly some knowledge of geometry and celestial events. Is there writing? That is one question. I mean, like their pottery is so well decorated and ornate that some people might suggest that, it's sort of conveying some kind of symbolic messages like language. That's sort of associated with like maybe keeping of their history. Oftentimes, as we've talked about, archaeologists do take an interest in it, to what extent the groups are going to war or not. Not a lot of evidence for inter-Japan warfare. Not to say it didn't happen at all and there wasn't murders and conflict, but no widespread evidence for like big battles that that you could maybe detect archaeologically if you were looking in the right place. Maybe they're paving things. It does look like, if you go back 13,000 years, that is some of the oldest like pots. People had been using ceramic technology prior than 13,000 years ago, but you don't really see like pots for like carrying, you know, liquids or grains or rice in the Euro-Western world until about 12,000, 11,000 years ago. Right, there is a picture of one of the pots, and a kind of this like a megalithic formation, some kind of stone circle. Looks like it very easily could be some kind of sundial, some kind of clock, some kind of calendar. Could obviously also be some kind of site of worship or all of the above. Again, not a lot of direct evidence on what this megalithic architecture meant to the people who built it. And so, yeah, the question is like they are cultivating plants, but right, if you take a look at the article on Blackboard, it doesn't seem like that's a huge part of their diet. Um, so, I mean, I sometimes, so yeah, if you take a look at the article on Blackboard, there's this is a quote from the article on the Jomon period. Many cultivated plants, but not a huge percentage of the calories were from the cultivated plants. Um, that doesn't mean that like I think sometimes I read that and I'm like sort of interpreting the author as sort of suggesting that this civilization was less good at farming. But I would again hazard that to caution against that interpretation that just because this population was not using farming to get the majority of his calories, it's probably a better thing. It's not as though like they didn't know. It's not as though they couldn't. It's not as though um, like they just hadn't figured out how to get more calories from farming. It's entirely possible they probably purposefully did not. If you remember, the first farming villages, they are unhealthier. There's greater, higher death rates. The diet is just much worse if you're relying totally on those wheats and grains. Obviously, the hunter-gatherer diet we talked about is a lot more diverse than the first farmers, between fruits, nuts, berries, meat. So it's entirely possible that it probably is the case that this was a population that like they could do a little farming if they needed to, but were probably healthier and probably for the better for them, still maintained getting most of their calories from hunting gathering. Um, Obviously also too, as we've seen with at least some theories about sort of the origins of farming and how it led to the rise of city-states and empires. I mean, most archaeologists today would probably argue that farming was not voluntary, that people did not actively choose to say, hey, let's be farmers. They were probably forced to, one way or the other. Um, often coerced one way or the other, or exploited one way or the other. Um, so it's entirely possible that having caps on not relying so extensively for the surpluses that you create with farming could be a mechanism, a social mechanism for preventing the rise of sort of hierarchical societies or tyranny or chiefs or kings from getting too much power. Um, so yeah, it's more of a rejection of full-scale agriculture than some kind of inability or less well developed. Yeah, actually, interestingly, uh, even ethnographically observed societies by cultural anthropologists certainly in the early 20th century, of populations in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, like kind of where like this Washington State is, Oregon, parts of British Columbia, Canada. Seems like there is some parallel. These were very big societies. They were not farming necessarily, or they maybe, cultivating a few plants. Um, but huge, like thousands and thousands of people in these like social units. These societies were multiple thousands. Um, some people have tossed out the theory that this is a bit of a stretch for me. I don't really believe this, but some people suggest that, you know, there was the crossing, and we'll talk about this more next couple classes, but obviously the crossing of people from Asia into the Americas via Alaska, you know, you know, 15,000 years ago, there was a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. Some people have suggested that the commonalities between sort of social organization that we found among living people on the Pacific West coast of the United States and Canada might be because they are descended from, or there's some kind of cultural continuity from populations in sort of East Asia, like Japan, parts of Siberia. Um, I mean, anything's possible. um, I I would kind of discourage the idea that there's like a lot of cultural continuity that maybe survived on that crossing. But it's not insane. It's entirely possible. Um, so to get back to this sort of complex hunter-gatherer idea, it's a concept that's sort of suggested in one of the articles on Blackboard. Um, so, high populations, actually some storage, some sort of like pots for storing things, jars, that sort of stuff, pottery. Um, social fluidity. What you probably don't necessarily see is a lot of hierarchy in these complex hunter-gatherer societies. The reason I think I have an angry face on there is because of my dislike of the word complex. I always have oftentimes when you see the word complex talking about a society in archaeology, um, it's almost like code for it's always usually presented as a good thing. It's always sort of suggested like this is a more advanced version of hunter-gatherers. Like this is hunter-gatherers plus. This is like, yeah, this is just like a better version of hunter-gatherers when you put the word complex in front of them. I would just push back against that. Like when we talk about complex society versus, we talk about the United States being a complex economy or something like that, as though it's better. Um, so I've complex is often used as a veiled way of like saying more developed or improved or more advanced in a way that I don't love, because I would suggest that any hunter-gatherer society is equally complex and like not simple, and certainly not more or less advanced than any other hunter-gatherer society. Um, it's sort of complex is often thrown into this teleological uh, trajectory that we're on. Teleological, again, is just a word that means that there's some inevitable trajectory that we're on, that we're all headed towards, that we're supposed to, that the human civilization has a conclusion that it's leading towards and is building towards, which I don't believe, but it's I don't know for a fact, but I don't believe that. But And I think it's kind of problematic. Anyway, sometimes when we talk about complex societies, like we'll talk about the Aztecs are a complex society, the Mesopotamians are a complex society. More than complex, what jumps out to me about some of these societies is that they are built on exploitation. Um, so, and they're, often very oppressive of large numbers of people. So I would almost, just to be kind of contrarian and controversial, I guess, um, almost use words like, you know, if we're talking about Babylonian or Akkadian society in the Mesopotamian region, rather than talk about these as complex civilizations, I would foremost highlight that they're exploitative civilizations and they rely on the exploitation of lots and lots of people. Um, oh, just one quick note. Based on DNA test, it looks like the civilization, this Jomon people, that we have extracted DNA from their bones and remains, does not seem to be genetically like the predecessors of the modern day Japanese population today. It seems as though there was a new group of people that moved into modern day Japan and displaced the Jomon people. It's somewhat debated, but okay. So switching gears, moving a little bit west over to the India-Pakistan region. Let's have a look at this very fascinating, very exciting civilization that is popping up on the Indus River Valley region. Much of this civilization empire does stretch across the border of in modern day India and Pakistan. Um, so yeah, lots of work has been done there. You can kind of see the dates on this Harappan Empire. This is stretching back to 3300 BC. That goes back to some of the Uruk and some of those early Mesopotamian sites. So this is basically almost completely concurrent with that period that we talked about from sort of the rise of the earliest city states in the Middle East to basically the Bronze Age collapse. This Indus River Valley civilization is going on doing almost the exact same, well, not the same stuff, but is living and existing. And it looks like probably trading with the Mesopotamian civilizations at almost the exact same time. But there are some key sort of differences about the character of this Harappan society, Harappan Empire, Harappan civilization. On the map, it's maybe not super clear, but these are all big sites. Sadly, again, because of sort of Western bias, whereas you could look at the map of the early sites in Mesopotamia and you could see things you recognize, maybe like Babylon and Assyria. Unless you are from this region, you might not recognize any of these names. Well, I mean, there's modern day uh, cities there in red, but you might not recognize any of these other sites. But these are just I would encourage you to think of this entire system along this Indus River Valley as it's kind of an alternate universe of what's going on between the Tigris and Euphrates, but it's just as big, just as complex, if you want to use that word complex, just as much sort of, just as big of populations, just as many people. But yeah, some of the key differences um, are that you don't really necessarily find a lot of that same big palace and temple architecture that you see in Mesopotamia. So like this is a civilization that's otherwise kind of going along a pretty similar trajectory, but doesn't have that kind of ostentatious architecture, glamorous architecture. Um, and so some people have actually looked at this and suggested this is a less like tyrannical society with like less kings and queens, because one of the things that archaeologists interpret big palaces and temples as indications that there is a big leader, a king or a queen or an emperor or a god or something like that, pharaoh. And it doesn't seem, it seems as though from the like remains of most of the cities and towns in the Harappan Empire that there's just a lot like the architecture of all the cities is more egalitarian. Like literally, like there's not much difference between the sizes of each people's houses. um, uh, right. So that's certainly one way of interpreting the evidence. And so a lot of people do suggest that the Harappan civilization was a little bit more less militaristic, more peaceful, less based on sort of rulers that are sort of tyrannical and leading different cities into war. If you remember, like looking at sort of the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Mesopotamia, there was the different cities all along the Tigris and Euphrates, and they would just like constantly, they'd be the big centers like Uruk and Babylon and Acadia, and they would sort of go to war with each other, every 500 years or so, 100 years really. And different cities would have control of the would be the ruling power of the era. It doesn't seem like that's going on here in the Harappan Indus River Valley. Um, Really cool like spa technology, really good plumbing. And the hair like that's something that archaeologists can detect pretty well. We'll talk, I mean, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but I didn't mention it too much when we talked about the Roman society, but classical Romans are often given so much credit for being really good plumbers. They had really good water systems. They had really good, public plumbing systems, really good wastewater treatment systems, or at least relatively good. But that's happening around like the year zero. This is going on, 2,000, 3,000 years before that. Really good plumbing, toilets and showers. When it comes to these big civilizations, it's a little bit unpleasant to think about. But one of the biggest things you have to think about if you're going to live in a city is waste management. As you probably know, some of the urban areas that's I mean that's one of the, like that can be a huge cause of disease among other things. Improper waste management in a city. Obviously, if waste management and your drinking supply gets mixed up, that's a huge vector for disease. Um, right. A couple other key aspects of the society are on the screen here. It definitely looks like there's sort of, I mean, like the urban planners here must have been really good. It seems like there's well kept streets. Most of the residential areas are the same size. A lot of people have sort of suggested that this is an indication of, you know, high level skill at sort of measuring, uh, just distances. Um, and oh, crucially, the Harappan writing system has not been decoded. So there is some writing that survives from this region and period, but it has not been deciphered, not been translated. Right, also on the screen you see they had toys. And yeah, it looks like there's definitely some exchange. I wish I had a map of like the wider region if I could zoom out um, on this. So if you follow my mouse, like Mesopotamia is kind of like over here, more or less. Um, uh, and yeah, so there is it does look like these populations know about each other to some extent. The Mesopotamians and the Harappan Indus Valley populations are aware of each other's existence. And it looks as though there's a lot more Harappan sailors that are going to Mesopotamia than Mesopotamians that are going to this Indus Valley. Um, that's what the evidence seems to indicate. Here's just a couple pictures of this is obviously an artist rendering. This is what it looks like today. If this sparks your imagination. Oh, just one quick note on the sort of translation and decipherment of texts. You might wonder, like, how do we uh, know what some of these ancient Egyptian or cuneiform writing means? Right. So the Harappan writing has no if in order to like decode it, it's very, very difficult to decode some lines. Here's like this is what Harappan writing looks like, or what the symbols look like. And we're pretty sure that this is some kind of written language. Maybe it's a hieroglyphic, maybe it's an ideographic, maybe it's alphabetical, or maybe some combination of all three. Um, But it's incredibly difficult to just sort of decipher this on its own. You kind of need to find some kind of key um, based on some existing language that we do know. That's sort of what happened with the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone you might have heard of is the stone that has the same text that's inscribed on it in three different languages. And so that just like broke down that like opened up our ability to translate ancient Egyptian, because it had on this same stone you have the same text written in ancient Greek, which we've known how to read for a long time. Not me personally, but some qualified archaeologists. And you have the same text written in ancient Egyptian, so that was kind of the key that was able to unlock how to read ancient Egyptian. And there just doesn't seem to be that with Harappan as of yet. Some people suggest Harappan is related to some of the language families found in India. Some people suggest that it is a totally isolated. And let's always remember that there's the language that you speak, and then there's the writing system. They don't necessarily have to reflect one each other. Obviously, like these are abstract symbols. Um, I mean, some of them do kind of look like things, but uh, you don't have to. It's entirely possible that Harappan, the people that were living in the Indus Valley in this region, spoke a language that is related to some Hindi languages found in India, but that the writing system is totally different. In which case, it would still be a struggle to solve. We'll another interesting case of language decipherment is the Mayan texts. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Americas a bit more. Okay, so yeah, we'll quickly also just mention a few things about some of what we know about the deep past of modern day China. You may be familiar with some of these dynasties. I'll just kind of do a quick little overview of some of the geographic aspects of the Shang Dynasty. Is, you can look at the dates there. This is, you know, a little bit after, the rise of uh, the first city-states in Mesopotamia, but certainly like 1766 BC is, high Babylonian times in Mesopotamia. So it's concurrent to some extent. The Shang Dynasty is, there is this amazing stuff called, there is some writing, obviously. There is these oracle bones, which are really fascinating objects that are often interpreted to be used for divination. Like you can, divination just means sort of predicting or foretelling or being able to reveal some hidden information. Um, uh, there's lots of things that different cultures and societies do for divination. Some cultures maybe roll bones, and based on how they land, that means it's going to rain or not. That's a kind of divination. Even like using a crystal ball or a magic 8 ball, that's a kind of divination. Um, uh, Mass-produced divination. Right, and so it does seem like there is some relationship to Chinese writing as we know it today. It's certainly been suggested that this is a farming agricultural society that is relying for, these are empire type level societies that are cultivating lots of plants and probably exploiting the labor of lots of peasants. Um, and usually those do require a lot of bureaucratic control. The Zhao dynasty, you can see the years there. The Qin dynasty, very short-lived. This is a period where there's sort of these warring states going on in China. Um, the first sort of elements of the famous Great Wall take off here in China, but yeah, a very short-lived kind of dynasty. But as we'll see, a lot was done. One thing that is just a fascinating sort of sight, I guess, if you're an archaeologist or anyone concerned with the past, is this huge terracotta army. I don't know if you've ever seen this or looked at this or got into this, but this is amazing. This is just the most really mind-boggling thing. Um, the size of this is like just boggling. Um, and so if you've never heard of this or seen this, these are sort of these terracotta, sort of, that's like kind of like ceramic uh, statues of these soldiers, I guess, and 8,000 of them. Keep in mind, like, you know, most cities, even like the biggest cities in the Mesopotamian region, maybe have like 10,000 people. So this is like 8,000 people. This is like a whole city full of statues. Um, and I would really, if you want to go down a wormhole on this and like investigate it further, as you can kind of tell from this picture, this isn't like some like mass produced like carbon copy that they're just rolling out like one kind of shape of a soldier and like making 8,000 of the same thing. There's incredible detail that goes into each and every one of these. As you can just like barely glimpse from here, like, obviously there's different faces. I mean, some have mustaches, some have facial hair, some don't. So they're all wearing different sort of hats, smiling, they're all different heights. It's incredibly fascinating. I mean, it almost makes you think something like, these are each of these represent like obviously it would have taken lots and lots of people to make all these people. Um, uh, is the technology to do this, A, is amazing. The time, the power, the energy that's put to this is amazing. There's this emperor, Qin, um, who by some accounts is pretty like narcissistic megalomaniac like most emperors are, who maybe like commissioned this and forced people to do this work. But and they also you can't really tell it here, but most of them are holding weapons too, or a lot of them are holding like real weapons, not like fake ceramic weapons, but like actual metal tipped like spears, which again is also just mind-boggling because I mean, if you're just being functional about it, you'd think, the emperor might want to have those weapons to actually use if they actually do go to war. Um, but yeah, lots of interpretations about this. I mean, there's a long tradition of course, of many emperors being buried. When an emperor dies, sometimes they're buried with their, servants and their soldiers sometimes, whether or not the servants are dead. So, they die because their emperor died. They get buried with them. Some people have suggested it's something like that. Really amazing stuff. Also, more than just soldiers, there's all this, and this all was accomplished, it seems, within this sort of, 2 decade or so period of this Qing dynasty. Um, I mean, just mind blowing. It could be, there's that theory that the Great Pyramids of Egypt are somewhat kind of like, there's just something to have the citizens do, like in between harvests and in between wars. Otherwise, the citizens that you control might leave your empire, because people usually don't like being subjected um, and exploited. So giving them some kind of mass civic project like this could be just something that like is busy work, but it's just mind blowing, really. Um, Han Dynasty, you see some further extensions of the Great Wall. Most of the Great Wall, as we know it today, was built a little bit later in the Ming Dynasty. So it's like 1300 or so AD. Right. So, I mean, again, obviously there's lots of work being done in China now. And, much like the Indus Valley civilization and you can see you see the rivers. The Indus River is a huge thoroughfare that like serves as a way to grow food and transport. Same with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that make up Mesopotamia, and also, of course, in China, you do have the Yellow River, um, and Yangtze. Uh, so also, yeah, a lot of these empires are coming up on rivers. That's sort of a key of uh, you know, these early empires and dynasties is that they generally have to grow up alongside rivers. Same with obviously Egypt and the Nile as well too. Okay, that's it for this quick little overview. Again, uh, I am selling short these civilizations and these regions by this one little kind of talk on these three hugely important regions. Um, I hope it does inspire some deeper investigating. And obviously, I imagine that within this class, there might be some people from these regions. And if you want to sort of, you know, uh, do more research. And if this was a proper semester, you would be assigned a final research paper. We're not doing that because this is a short summer session, but often at times it might be very interesting for you to look into sort of, doing a final paper on one of these civilizations or societies or dynasties. Okay, that's it.